Devout Muslims long to go on pilgrimage. But for Ismaili Muslims, the religious highlight of a lifetime is to set eyes on the face of their spiritual leader, the Aga Khan. This is their leader, Prince Karim al-Husseini Aga Khan.
Islam in general is changing at the moment. We have to deal more and more with the West. This is one of the very, very big difficulties we've faced all along. And we are always having to work against a background which is not Islamic.
These are troubled times. Islam is at odds with itself and the West. Too often, extremists call the shots. One Muslim spiritual leader, the Aga Khan, has been persevering for 50 years to bridge the divide. Executive jets are not a common sight in Afghanistan these days. The few world leaders who chance their necks demand high levels of security. On the eve of his Golden Jubilee, he has come to a land that is home to the Taliban and once sheltered Al-Qaeda. Nobody is more threatened by terrorists than moderate Muslims like the Aga Khan and his followers. Today, the Ummah, the world community of Islam, is scarred by terrorists. The Aga Khan has been the leader of the Ismaili Muslims for 50 increasingly troubled years. A man of peace in a land of war, the Aga Khan has come to Kabul to preach a traditional, non-political and spiritual Islam.
Holy Quran says, verily, God does not change a people's condition unless they change that which is in themselves.
The Aga Khan has been a familiar figure on the world stage.
For many Muslims, the Aga Khan is a voice of moderation, a voice of reason, a voice of an Islam that talks about pluralism, of diversity.
He ranks amongst the foremost leaders in the Muslim world who are seriously thinking about dialogue between civilizations and dialogue between religious and cultural communities.
He was only 20 when he became the Imam, his people's religious leader.
The enormous responsibility which had come to me, I didn't feel prepared for it. It was a very, very heavy burden to take over.
The world may have changed, but the Aga Khan has maintained the love and loyalty of his followers. They regard him with a reverence that some Muslims see as un-Islamic.
Do they see the Aga Khan as the manifestation of God's grace to humankind? Yes, they do.
He is our Imam. We are his followers. Without his blessings, I don't believe anything would move.
I believe that what he tells me is what I should accept and follow.
He's looking after our future. He's guiding us secularly and spiritually.
do they look at the Aga Khan as God, as Allah? No, they do not.
The noble and peaceful religion of Islam is not a monolith, but a mosaic, with two main strands, Shia and Sunni, and with many different branches under them. It is the fastest growing religion.
Islam is fundamentally pluralistic. What Islam emphasizes is the oneness of God. But the Quran is quite specific that God created humankind in different colors, different tribes, different ethnicities, as part of the divine plan. And therefore Islam celebrates the pluralism of human societies, of human languages. So whoever believes in the oneness of God, who believes in the message of Muhammad and follows the Sunnah of Muhammad, or aspires to follow the Sunnah of Muhammad, is part of the Ummah of Muhammad.
Of the world's 1.4 billion Muslims, less than 15% live in Arab countries or the Middle East. Scattered across 30 countries, from China to Canada, there are at least two main branches of Shia Ismaili Muslims, of whom perhaps 15 million follow the Aga Khan. Throughout their history, they have been persecuted and often seen as heretics by some fellow Muslims.
They don't take the Quran as it is, and they don't abide by the practices shown in the Quran.
I uphold the position that Ismailis are part of the Ummah of Muhammad. And that is, I think, is something that is unequivocally factual based upon this hadith of the Prophet.
All communities in Islam will have their friends and their people who are less well disposed. The faith has many, many different communities, as in the Christian world. If you ask a Russian Orthodox what he thinks of the Catholic Church, you might not get the sort of answer that
Christian
you would think is, let's say, ecumenical.
The Ismaili faithful tie the percentage of their earnings to the Aga Khan, most of which goes back into the community. He also inherited a private fortune, but neither he nor his followers see a contradiction between his roles as a wealthy man and a spiritual guide.
The Ismailis had never accepted a fundamental distinction between the spiritual and the material, and indeed Ismaili philosophy really believes that the two are completely integral. You can't, in a sense, have one without the other.
I mean, Islam doesn't tell you that you have to give up the material world and kind of become a monk. It never says that.
That is very much a Christian question. And Islam has a completely different premise. Islam doesn't divide faith and world. What it says is don't abuse of the world. If you are wealthy, use what is necessary for you to live appropriately and be generous with the rest.
Unlike other Muslims, Ismailis pray 3 times a day, not 5. Outsiders cannot pray with them, but Ismaili men and women pray together.
In our mosque, we all share the same hall. We gather to pray together, which is as it should be.
Ismaili women pray side by side with the men in their prayer space. The veil, the hijab, it's not encouraged.
That matters quite a lot to me because it says we're one under heaven in the eyes of God.
In most mosques, as here in Jordan, women are kept out of sight.
Sunni Muslims, for instance, telling me they cannot imagine that men and women could be praying side by side and with the women unveiled. There's a great deal of emphasis placed on women's education and the general advancement of women in society.
In Ismaili schools, boys and girls receive equal opportunities.
There has been a tendency in parts of the Islamic world to see education as a trampoline to let women take positions in society which the Muslim world or Muslims might consider inappropriate.
Ismailis are heirs to a rationalist tradition in Islam, which goes back to the very early period in the 800s-900s. There was a kind of reaction against this, and the majority tradition, the majority Sunni tradition, abandoned a rationalistic approach for what you might call a much more imitative approach. You simply follow the rules as they've been laid down. You don't question the rules.
These young boys belong to a fundamentalist madrasa in northwest Pakistan. Prayers start at 4 in the morning. More than half the day is spent learning the Quran by heart.
Well, I think in the very conservative areas of the Muslim world, you have a tremendous emphasis on rote learning. Young children are required to memorize the Quran in its totality. But the Ismailis, and other Shias too, have always had a much more rationalizing approach, which is that behind the words of the Quran, there are spiritual meanings which have to be understood in the context of different times.
I would go back to the time of the Prophet, where the notion of intellect is very, very powerful indeed. And what we're trying to do is to bring this notion of intellect as part of faith forwards in what we're trying to achieve.
For Ismailis, faith, intellect, and social improvement go hand in hand. So the Aga Khan devotes his time and resources to hospitals, universities, schools, and reducing poverty. But this can put him at odds with those Muslim fundamentalists who fear he is trying to propagate the Ismaili faith.
There are groups who fear that the Aga Khan's economic development efforts and education efforts in northern Pakistan, the building of schools, the building of hospitals, is part of some sort of plot that he's trying to take over that part of the country.
Ismailis believe that the man who became their 49th Imam in 1957 is a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. But Ismaili history has been shaped by persecution and sometimes bloodshed. After the Prophet's death, the burning issue was whether Muhammad's role as a spiritual guide should pass to his own family or his loyal followers. Two civil wars divided the Muslim world between the Sunnis, who are the overwhelming majority, and the Shias.
The main difference between the Sunnis and the Shias is that the Sunnis basically look back to the custom and practice of the Prophet Muhammad.
The Shia notion is that authority to interpret religious matters and political authority was, in fact, the right of one man, and specifically a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad.
As time went on, both Shia and Sunni branches split, often as a result of power and politics. The Ismailis are a branch of Shia Islam.
The role of the Imam as embodying an unbroken line that connects us to the Prophet is a very important position, particularly within the Shia community, and the Ismailis represent the upholding of that principle.
Today, most Shiites, like those of Iran, believe Muhammad's last true descendant disappeared or went into hiding centuries ago, and they await his return at the end of time.
What makes Ismailis different from the mainstream Shiite Islam?
Probably that there is a living Imam who traces his family back to Hazrat Ali. The majority of the Shia today are known as 12 Shia, and they believe in the hidden Imam.
The Shias believe that in addition to the Prophet's practice, you have to have guidance from the Imam. In the case of the majority Shia community, that guidance is given by the Ayatollahs. In the case of the Ismailis, that guidance comes exclusively from the Imam of the Ismailis, who is the Aga Khan.
The next Imam cannot be appointed during your lifetime.
He is appointed during my lifetime in the sense that I'm the person who knows who the next Imam would be.
But only you.
He only me, but he becomes Imam when I die.
The Ismailis' history has made them who they are. They came into their own in 969 of the Common Era. Seen here with Britain's Prince Charles, the Aga Khan is opening an exhibition of his family's extraordinary collection of Islamic art. Many of the most beautiful objects were sponsored by his own ancestors 1,000 years ago in Cairo. Cairo was the capital of the Fatimid Empire. Ruled by the Aga Khan's ancestors, it was one of the pinnacles of Islamic civilization.
For the first time in Muslim history, the Shia were able to establish their own independent state, which eventually turned into a very large empire covering not only North Africa, but parts of Sicily, of Europe, and for a short period of time also Mecca and Medina.
The glories of the Fatimid era include Al-Azhar, the world's oldest university. In this enlightened age, the arts flourished, and so too did philosophy and theology.
In Fatimid times, you have Ismaili philosophers drawing on Greek philosophy, Neoplatonic thought, Gnosticism, affirming in a way that religious truths can be found in many different cultural systems.
Like Ismailis today, the Fatimid Empire was a beacon of learning and a model of religious tolerance.
Egypt had a much larger Christian population and quite a big Jewish population.
It was a very pluralist society where Christians, Jews, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims all worked together for the betterment of the empire.
They never really tried to convert the majority of the Egyptian population to Ismailism.
But in 1171 of the Common Era, an army advanced on Cairo. It was led by the mighty Saladin. Saladin and his army overthrew the Fatimid Empire and its strand of the Shiite Islam. Once again, Sunnis became the dominant sect in Islam.
It symbolizes this struggle of a minority community to survive against all odds, surrounded on all sides by hostile forces. And you had a very powerful empire that was trying to get rid of the Ismaili presence there.
Hopelessly outnumbered, it was claimed the Ismailis resorted to selective assassinations.
The Ismailis in Iran eventually became known in the West as the Assassins, primarily through the writings of Marco Polo and other Europeans.
The word assassin comes from the Arabic hashashin, which means hashish takers.
The assassins had been accused of performing murders, of taking drugs, of jumping off cliffs in their dedication and devotion and instruction to their imam.
A very improbable story, because if you're actually going to assassinate someone, you probably need to have a very steady hand.
A lot of these constructions of the Ismailis as assassins, as really a cult of assassins, is in fact a creation, on the one hand, of propaganda, and on the other hand, the transmission of some of these stories by Western travelers like Marco Polo, who picked these stories up from some Sunni sources.
In the end, it wasn't Sunnis who in 1257 razed the fortress of Alamut and slaughtered its Ismaili defenders. The death blow came from the east, in the shape of the Golden Horde, Mongol horsemen led by the grandson of Genghis Khan.
The libraries, all the documentation, everything was destroyed. He issued an edict that every Ismaili should be killed, and that not even a baby should be spared. What happened, I think, sent shockwaves, into the Ismaili psyche.
After the fall of Alamut, it was believed until late in the 19th century that the Ismailis had vanished.
The Ismailis had not vanished. Instead, they had blended in with their neighbors in Persia, Syria, and India, hiding their identity, praying in secret. To this day, outsiders are usually not allowed to witness their religious services.
There have been times in Ismaili history where communities have been persecuted, where communities have found it difficult to practice their faith openly, and as a result, many communities today have inherited a culture of exclusivity, of privacy, in which they choose to practice their faith, sometimes outside the open eyes of others.
It was 500 years before Ismailis showed their faces again. This photo, taken in the mid-1800s, shows the 46th Imam. The Shah of Iran had granted him the title of Aga Khan, meaning Commander-in-Chief. After an abortive uprising, he fled to Afghanistan. In 1877, the present Aga Khan's grandfather was born in the part of British India that is now Pakistan. Perhaps nobody has had more influence on the Aga Khan's life than his grandfather. Only 7 years old when he succeeded, that little boy would go on to create the Ismaili community as we know it today.
He really decided at a very young age to go the whole way to modernize his community as fast and furiously as he could.
He noticed very early on that while the vast majority of Indians, the Hindus, were being educated through proper educational systems, many of the Muslims were still living in rural areas and were not getting access to proper education.
The third Aga Khan was determined to learn from the British imperialists.
At that time, a lot of progressive-minded Muslims realized that to improve the social conditions of Muslim people, it was better to go with the flow of British power than to try to resist it.
The grandfather decided that girls should be educated, and that if there's a girl and a boy in a family and there's only enough money to educate one, you educate the girl, because she brings up a family. And he decided, he was quite right, that if women got educated, modernity and progress was incredibly fast.
Just how well the Ismaili community had prospered became clear when on his Jubilee anniversary, they presented him with his own weight in gold, then diamonds, and finally platinum.
The money that was collected from the various communities for this purpose was actually redistributed back to the community for their various welfare projects. In hindsight, what it was actually able to do for the community was to establish them. It built schools, it built educational facilities.
So you could say, in a sense, they were donations by the community to the community, with the Imam as a sort of clearinghouse in the middle.
The third Aga Khan went on to play a prominent role on the world stage. During the troubled years before World War II, he was president of the League of Nations. After the war, he was an important player in the events that led to Indian independence and the creation of the Muslim state of Pakistan. In the post-war years, the third Aga Khan relished his position as a former world statesman and bon viveur.
Wealth is fine, wealth creation and having a kind of fulfilled earthly life, including sensual pleasure, is very much part of Islam.
He was a seeker after publicity. He enjoyed the fun of it.
The image of a racehorse owner and breeder who was quite literally worth his weight in gold fixed itself in the Western imagination.
You have the reputation of being one among the 6 richest men in the world, which is obviously a very nice thing to be if it's true. I would like to know if that is true, and if so, whether it's possible to tell us at all where the wealth comes from.
I should consider it as a great, very great dishonor to be so rich as all that. Of course, I have the control of what is the funds of the imamate, and I certainly receive very large sums, but by far the greater part of it I spend on various other objects that are not personal.
But behind his ebullient exterior, he remained a shrewd judge of human nature. The Aga Khan's son and heir, the dashing Ali Khan, was a decorated war hero, much admired for his work for the Ismaili community. But his love of beautiful women, thoroughbred horses, and fast sports cars attracted the wrong headlines. His first marriage was to the English society beauty Joan Guinness, mother of the present Aga Khan and his brother. That marriage ended in divorce. Subsequent romances culminated in his wedding to Hollywood's hottest star.
Valerie near Cannes was recently the center of attraction for all filmgoers, for it was here that Rita Hayworth's wedding took place. The wedding had created world interest. Privacy was impossible. But then that's always the lot of a film star, especially if she marries a prince.
The third Aga Khan remained fond of Ali Khan's first wife, Joan, and kept in close touch with her son, Prince Karim. Karim was clearly a very different character from his father.
Well, as I said before, in a sense, my father was an elder brother to me. I saw him occasionally. I saw him during the holidays. My grandfather was more the senior figure in the family, with whom you discussed what you were doing at school and not doing at school. And it was a very different relationship, and he was very much the head of the family.
You've been at Harvard University for years. What are you studying?
Oriental history.
Oh, yes.
And it's a wonderful subject to study in college because you get a chance to get the religious background as well as the political and social background.
I'll tell you one thing about Karim. We thought there was something wrong with him. He didn't drink and didn't smoke. And we were wild. Everybody was wild in those days. Nobody worked. Well, he did. And he was a very serious young man.
In 1957, at the age of 79, the Aga Khan III died. They would bury him in Egypt, the land of his Fatimid ancestors. Before the funeral took place, they had opened his will, and it contained a huge surprise.
When the will was read, it was found out that it was not Ali Khan as expected to succeed him as Imam, but actually Ali Khan's son, the present Imam, Karim Aga Khan. And for many Ismailis, this was really a surprise.
20-year-old Aga Khan IV proclaims the start of his reign. In his predecessor's words, the Ismaili sect needs a modern-minded young leader to cope with the problems of an atomic world.
This sensational story could have divided the Ismaili community against itself. Feelings threatened to boil over in Syria, where the charismatic Ali Khan was adored. Ali Khan may have felt disappointed, but he was loyal to his father and he loved the son who had replaced him. He traveled to Syria and told Ismailis to honor his father's will.
My father's position was delicate, but he could not have been more loyal, more supportive, more understanding. And his integrity in responding to that decision was genuinely remarkable.
Ali Khan went on to serve as Vice President of the United Nations General Assembly, but tragically, not for long.
I think Ali Khan's father knew very well what he was doing, and I thought it was a very wise choice. And as it turned out to be, it was a difference of 2 years. He would have been Aga Khan for 2 years because the accident would have happened anyway, I think. So.
2 years later, Ali Khan died in a high-speed head-on car crash near Paris. Without his father's love and advice, the young Aga Khan was on his own. The next year, Prince Karim decided to allow the American filmmaker Bob Drew to make a documentary about him and his work.
He had a secular leadership role, and in addition to that, he had a spiritual role. He was a spiritual leader. At the same time, the Aga Khan was an athlete. He was a Olympic-class skier.
It was double-edged. On the one hand, of course, he inherits immeasurable wealth, huge power, most eligible bachelor in the world, wonderful looking, great athlete, all these things, fantastic. You think this is king of the universe.
And the women, the girls, reacted a little bit the way I've seen the girls react toward John F. Kennedy. He was a shining star for them.
On the other hand, terrific responsibility. Suddenly, his freedom to enjoy his youth was, in a sense, taken away from him.
Merci.
From that moment onwards, he was working a 12, 16-hour day.
I hope you won't misunderstand the question if I ask whether this job really can be done without a wife.
His passion for skiing led him to meet his future wife, the British model Sally Croker-Poole.
I wanted the Ismailis to know before anyone else, and we had to take great precautions to make sure that that did happen, and I'm happy that it did.
Lady James, you've become a Muslim.
Yes, I have.
Has that been difficult?
No, it wasn't difficult for me to at all, because I wanted to do it, and I'm very happy about it, and I feel very at ease.
Married in a lavish ceremony in Paris, they had 3 children and stayed together for 27 years. But neither this nor a second marriage was to last.
They want their imam to be happy. I remember once talking to a very senior Ismaili when he was divorcing his first wife. His comment I found actually rather moving. He said, "The imam has been wounded." And there is a sense that emotional wounds have perhaps affected him. He is not a playboy, it's a completely misunderstood role that he has. He does not, and perhaps has not, had the energy, time, to give to his family because of his commitment to his bigger family, which is maybe 10, 15 million people.
right from the start, the young Aga Khan undertook a punishing schedule. Here, he is seen arriving in Kenya.
The Aga Khan will go to the mosques of the Ismailis to give them the spiritual communion that only his presence can evoke.
As one senior Ismaili explained to me, he is the child of the community. He belongs to his people. He doesn't really have the freedom just to be, you know, a rich man cruising around the world.
Almost a lifetime later, the faithful still remember the impact his visit had on them.
He saw me behind everybody else at the back of the room, and he said, "Akbar, come and sit next to me."
Yes, I've seen that.
50 years ago, the young Akbar was needing advice about his life and career. Akbar has never seen this film before.
I think you have to think now, what is the decision for him to take if you make him?
Probably they may think they will, that's his thing, well, why don't you make it there?
The way he captures your heart, I think that's all you need is one time, such an occasion, to feel forever.
He had become Aga Khan at a time of epic and sometimes wrenching change in the world. Uncertain times can result in instability and violence.
We were at the eve of decolonization. We were at a time of bitter conflict in the Cold War environment. So these were all situations that I entered rather young.
The Aga Khan came into this world, and of course, because many of the Ismailis lived within the former colonies, they were also affected by these tumultuous changes.
In 1972, Ismailis were threatened again. The young Aga Khan faced his first real life or death crisis. The threat came in the ample shape of Uganda's military tyrant, Idi Amin Dada. Amin was whipping up hatred for the Asian community.
What was it like meeting Idi Amin?
Well, I mean, he was frankly on the very extreme limits of sanity.
And how did you handle that?
You couldn't. The times I saw him, you tried to get him to focus on real issues, and he would slide off into other issues. You couldn't get clarity on anything. I think the situation there was that there was enough forewarning of what was to come that I was able to put a number of things in place.
A curious combination, killer and clown. Amin's slogan was Uganda for the Ugandans. That meant East Asians had to leave the country within 90 days. This propaganda film captures the mood of the time.
Uganda is at war, economic war. The imperialists and their agents have been kicked out of their seats. As non-citizen Asians prepared to leave, hundreds of shops in Uganda's capital, Kampala, and in upcountry towns remained closed. Most of the temples, only used by the Asians, were closed. It was later discovered at Aga Khan Temple that they had been used as money hideouts as well as for prayers.
Well, we heard on the radio that Idi Amin said that we had to go.
It was most probably their religion that sowed the seed of isolation from the general public.
I couldn't understand at that time why my family would have to leave, because that was our home.
Ismaili businesses and property were seized at a fraction of their real value.
Or however rich or poor you were, it didn't matter. You would only get $1,000. And that's all we got.
Their bid to turn Kampala and other towns in Uganda into another Bombay had failed.
When we arrived at Entebbe, scene was really, really chaotic. Very chaotic condition, but anyway, finally, we boarded and we left the country.
Uganda's once prosperous Ismailis had become stateless refugees. The Aga Khan and his uncle, who was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees at the time, had to persuade foreign leaders to give them shelter.
And I was very fortunate in the sense that I had a strong personal relationship with President Kenyatta. I had a strong personal relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau, who, after all, was a global statesman. And I said to these statesmen, if a crisis occurs, can you help? And both said yes.
He was fantastic. He got Trudeau lined up to airlift everybody who had Ugandan passports, Ismailis who had Ugandan passports.
But I think the general principle of Canada helping people in need and distress is accepted by all Canadians.
His response to that issue, I think, created a great deal of confidence in the community that there's somebody who's there, who's connected, who's well connected to world leaders, and who can help look after them. He doesn't just talk the talk.
No, you know, the Canadian government extended a level of cooperation, understanding, help that was absolutely remarkable.
Not for the first time in their history, Ismaili Muslims found themselves uprooted. This was the first time that an Ismaili community had to recreate itself in the West.
What have you learned so far about the people who came to Canada?
Well, first that they are a changed community psychologically. There is a sense of peace and equanimity, which is really very visible. There is a sense of challenge. They view Canada as a country with great prospects.
The Ismailis had shown that there was nothing incompatible between their Islamic faith and Western values. The first Muslim to be elected to Canada's federal parliament is an Ismaili.
After, obviously, 9/11, when we had, such a confusion about Islam, such a confusion about what is the message of Islam, and unfortunate images of terrorists being from Islamic background, promoting a vision of Islam that I think majority of people involved in Islam would denounce.
Three decades later, and the Aga Khan is back in Uganda, at a place where Idi Amin once tortured his victims.
The Aga Khan feels very attached to Uganda. He has been here several times. He's meeting His Excellency the President, and they're always talking about investment. Right now, they have just invested in the Serena Hotel.
The young Aga Khan inherited from his grandfather a network of charities, schools, and hospitals. He has continued to build on that legacy.
He took on these very heavy responsibilities 50 years ago, 1957. He was coming into a world in which I think we were all starting to become aware that the differences between rich and poor were not going to just continue unaddressed, that people in poverty, which were more than half the world, were not going to be silent.
Headquartered in Geneva, the Aga Khan's development network, with 70,000 workers, distributes $400 million each year to create hope and opportunity in the developing world.
The AKDN, the Aga Khan Development Network, is an organization today that's active in more than 35 countries around the world, made up of 9 independent but closely cooperative agencies, institutions, and the like. We certainly are led by a prominent Muslim leader, and his ideas and his interpretation of Islam are framing principles for us.
They influence the principles all the time and in every way. And we try to articulate these principles. First of all, we're looking at poverty. The faith of Islam calls on all Muslims who have means to be generous.
He was looking at the question of how you can encourage families and individual family leaders to live a better life by giving them opportunity, and to encourage them in terms of education of their children so that there could not be a limitation on the possibilities for his followers, but indeed an opportunity.
Many of his projects, like this hotel project in Uganda, are meant to show a profit. The Aga Khan believes in self-sustaining investments that will create work and make money, which can then be reinvested in the country.
Another word for it is patient capital. The purpose of our for-profit operations is to demonstrate to other private investors that if you're willing to take the time and perhaps a little additional risk, there are returns to be achieved. Setting standards, setting goals, setting models that can be emulated and whatever, not by preaching about them, but by doing them, is very much at the heart of what he does.
Good morning, good morning. Say good morning, His Highness. Good morning,
Please go on, I'm going to join the class.
All right.
His Highness the Aga Khan is a very hands-on manager. We have a living founder who's very directly engaged in the activities of all of the institutions. I mean, he travels extensively. He certainly gets to all or most of the countries that we work in every year.
It's probably nearly 60–70% of the time he's actually in field work. And in every part of the world he will visit. As you know, we are operating somewhere in about 30 or 32 countries. So you can imagine the amount of traveling that involves.
The majority of his time is spent on the road, without any question. It's truly a very heavy load that he carries.
His personal passion is to preserve the architectural heritage of the Islamic world. He believes preserving and restoring these cities is essential for human dignity.
Well, I think any civilization which loses its cultural expression is a civilization which has lost something.
In the center of Cairo, he has turned a 500-year-old garbage dump into a park. This 20-year project has transformed the slums that once surrounded the park, restored historic houses, created jobs, and lessened poverty.
The idea there was to restore the historic city, which was important to us, to address the ultra-poor, and to try to see whether we could add a social and economic dimension to culture or cultural restoration, which I think has worked.
But it's harder to change old prejudices.
We hear that the Ismailis have gold, jewelry, and treasures. But we are a simple people. We don't have large fortunes or a lot of money. And between Muslims, we don't compete over that. For Muslims, life on earth is just a passage to eternal life.
The Ismaili believe that in order to achieve a certain spiritual freedom, you actually have to have some material goods. The other thing is that they really do believe that you can help the poor by getting rich. You're not going to help the poor just by being poor yourself.
The collapse of communism in the 1990s enabled him to be reunited with the Ismailis of Central Asia, like these in Tajikistan. As the Cold War has receded, a new challenge has emerged, this time from within Islam itself. Terrorists have killed far more Muslims in the name of Islam than they have Christians or Jews. In North Pakistan, so close to the border with war-torn Afghanistan, Ismailis were among the first to come under attack.
The main context in which these events have happened has been the war in Afghanistan, Talibanization of Afghanistan. A lot of refugees coming into the western part of Pakistan, and just a general ratcheting up of the temperature.
The Aga Khan may have hoped that development projects he had funded would diffuse the situation.
His attempts at creating these bridges of understanding have in fact been misinterpreted, again, because people view this as, again, as a threat to Sunni triumphalism.
There are mullahs who come out of those madrasa schools who say Ismailis aren't Muslims.
In 1982, in Chitral, the small Ismaili community was becoming an object of suspicion.
It started with the rumor that the Ismailis had burned a mosque. This rumor turned out to be a false rumor, but the result of this rumor was that the people were incited.
Salima's father used to preach at the Ismaili mosque, but her father also ran a hostel for boys of all faiths.
The Sunni people had said they were going to burn the hostel and the mosque. They're going to kill the big leaders and burn their houses down. My mother said to my father, the situation is very bad, so don't go to the office. But my father said, I really like my religion, and my father did not listen. My house was up near the river, and on the other side there was a road.
They shot a couple of people, and in one case, they threw a live person from the bridge. They say that when they were throwing him down, they said that you become a Sunni, and say I will become a Sunni, and he refused. And when they were throwing him down, he said, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, means that I am a Muslim, but not at your command.
11 Ismailis were killed in the pogrom. The body of Salima's father was never found.
That sometimes it feels as if we are losing the battle, that enlightened Islam is proving no match by definition, because we're not hardliners. We're accepting, we're tolerant, we're liberal. By definition, that means we are weak in front of very determined, aggressive foes.
When Taliban fighters seized power in Afghanistan, Ismailis' lives were on the line. The Taliban saw all Shia Muslims as heretics and slaughtered thousands. Like other Shias, the Ismailis were under constant threat.
In the mosques, under the Taliban regime, people were praying day and night. The Taliban era was one in which they would take people by force to pray. Everything they did was by force.
I believe that we have never faced a greater threat. And by we, I mean not just Ismailis, I mean Islam itself. We have never had such internal chaos and external threats coming at the same time. It must keep him awake at night to imagine what the next 50 years holds. Will they wipe us out?
Fundamentalist aggression took to the world stage when Osama bin Laden launched his attacks on the West. The Aga Khan does not believe this is a religious war.
They're not driven by faith. They're driven by unsolved political issues. And the understanding of the Muslim world in the non-Muslim world is shallow, and that's a fact. I don't think it's a clash of civilization. I think it's a clash very often of ignorance.
Would you have said that that ignorance would have led to something like the invasion of Iraq?
I think that would have been a major aspect in the decisions that were taken in regard to Iraq. I have to tell you that Iraq is not my number one focus. My number one focus is Afghanistan.
the Aga Khan has not given up on Afghanistan. In his Jubilee year, he visited Kabul. Many of the children here, in this hospital in Kabul, are victims of the fighting between Western forces and the Taliban. But the Aga Khan is investing in more than just hospitals and schools. He has also established a cell phone company. It generates 6% of the government's revenue. Significantly, it provides work for women.
Certainly in some conservative societies, the notion of employing women outside the home is something that others take exception to.
Do you feel this might be seen as provocative by the more violent fundamentalists?
No, I don't think so, because I mean, yes, there's always an extreme group that could seek problems.
He knows that changing attitudes will take time.
Well, I once said to him, Your Highness, I've been in the development business for many years, and I'm struck that you have a long-term view on development. And he said, well, I've been doing this for almost 50 years. You know, it's not instant coffee. Development is not instant coffee. And he said, one thing I've learned is that permanent change, permanent positive change, simply takes time.
He does not think in days or months or years. He thinks things in generational terms. It's not a quick fix.
Ali, Ali. Dam Hamadam.
In the summer of 2007, on the 50th anniversary of his succession, Ismaili delegates came to the estate just north of Paris, where the Aga Khan lives. They came from communities in 30 countries to pay tribute to their imam. For 50 years, the Aga Khan has tried to act as a moderating force within Islam, and also as a bridge between Islam and the West.
Viewed from a historical perspective, the activities of the Aga Khans to create bridges in many different ways between different communities does in fact come from the experience of a minority community that's been persecuted and having lived in societies that are not able to tolerate difference.
The Ismaili have a kind of message for the modern world, which is how to live in a pluralistic world. And that is a message which other Muslim thinkers are rapidly catching up with.
I think I can say that there is no other community leader that I know who has done better. And he's done it by the force of his personality and both his goodness and his practicality.
Then how do we build a common humanity? But I think what's important is to hope and work for and pray for a cosmopolitan civil ethic, where the unity of the human race becomes an ethical purpose for all faiths.